Bonjour et bienvenue. Hello and welcome. In today's video, we're going to be talking about an introduction to verbs in French. Une introduction aux verbes en français. In today's video, we'll go over a couple things. We'll go over, first off, what is a verb. We'll get into talking about some of the pronouns that we use in French, les pronoms. And then we'll look at an example of one of the most common verbs that we see in French, the verb avoir. What is a verb? A verb is an action word. It's used to describe what the subject is doing in a sentence. Verbs and nouns are the main part of a sentence and lets a reader or listener know what is taking place. For example, Marco jumps. Marco in this sentence would be the subject, so it would be the noun, and jumps would be the verb. It's describing an action that Marco is doing. A verb can also be a sentence by itself. For example, run. So let's quickly look at les pronoms personnels. In English, these are personal pronouns, or we can just call them pronouns for short. In French, just as we do in English, we split our pronouns into two categories, singular and plural. On the left-hand side of my chart, you'll see the singular pronouns. And this describes when one person is doing an action. So you would use je, tu, il, or elle when only one person is doing an action. On the right-hand side, you have the plural pronouns, nous, vous, ils, and elles, and that's when you have two or more people performing an action. So what do these pronouns translate to in English? What's their English form? Well, let's take a look at that right now. So we're going to start off with the singulier side, the singular side, and remember, this is when you're talking about a pronoun to describe one person. So in French, the pronoun je would translate to the pronoun I in English. Tu would translate to the pronoun you in English. Il would translate to the pronoun he, and elle would translate to the pronoun she. Now, on the other side, this is when we're talking about two or more people. Nous would translate to the pronoun we, me and you, or me and him, or me and her. So you're describing two or more people. Vous would translate to the pronoun they when you're talking about a group of two or more people. Ils is also going to translate to the pronoun they, but that's when you're talking about males. And it has to be more than one male, remember that, or else you'd use the pronoun il without the s. So if you notice the s, that indicates it's plural, that there's more than one. And if you haven't guessed it already, elles would also be they, except they're going to be females. So before we get into the examples of conjugating, let's just quickly go over what conjugating is, because this was kind of confusing for me when I was a kid. So what is conjugating? It basically means to put a verb in the right tense. So let's say hypothetically you're eating lunch and somebody asks you the question, what are you doing? You probably would answer by saying, I'm eating. If you were to answer by saying, I eat, you may get a funny look by that person. So essentially what conjugating does is it makes our sentences sound correct by turning I eat into I'm eating. So I hope that makes a little bit more sense about what conjugating is and why it's important to conjugate. And without further ado, let's get into our example for today. So the example I chose is the verb avoir, and in French this is one of the most important verbs, and it's also one of the most common verbs you'll see. In English this means to have. So I know there's a lot going on in this chart, so let me just explain it very quickly for you. So the first two columns, I put the pronouns in. So you have the English pronoun, and then you have the French pronoun right beside it. After that, we see the verb in French, and it does look a lot different than this verb over here, and I'll explain why in a couple seconds. And on the last column, we have the pronoun and the verb. I guess you can call it a very basic sentence in English. So let's look at this first. So we have I have, you have, he has with an S, she has with an S, we have, you have, they have, and they have. So if you notice, there's a change when you get to he and she. Instead of having a VE, it ends with the letter S. This is conjugating, essentially. In French, unfortunately, it's not just he and she that change. It's kind of all of them that change. And ironically, he and she also stay the same endings in English as they do in French. So I guess that's two less of them to memorize for you. But unfortunately for now, especially with this verb avoir, you are going to have to memorize it. As we learn more verbs, there's certain patterns that you can use to help you just conjugate, and you really only have to memorize a couple different endings. But in the case of avoir, you've just got to memorize this one. Now, the second change you may have also noticed is over here under the pronoun. Je, I also put a J with an apostrophe. Now, there's a rule in French that if a word ends with the letter E and the next word starts with a vowel, you have to take off the E from the first word and turn it into an apostrophe. This is a very basic rule in French, and it's very common to see this. So in French, the conjugated form would turn into j'ai, tu as, es, il a with an A, elle a with an A. So il and elle, like I said, they always stay the same. Nous avons with an ONS to end it. Vous avez with the EZ to end it. Ils ont and elles ont. And once again, ils and elles, whether it's singular or whether it's plural, these two will always be the same, and these two will always be the same. Okay? So that's two less things for have to memorize. All right, so now that we know what the conjugated form of avoir looks like, which is this over here, j'ai, tu as, il a, elle a, nous avons, vous avez, ils ont, elles ont. Let's look at some more practice questions, and I'll actually show you the full way of how you would conjugate something. So, the question asks, utilise le verbe avoir au présent de l'indicatif. Use the present form of the verb to have. So, when you conjugate, the first step of conjugating is always to locate the pronoun. So you know what form of the verb to use. So to do that, you usually look right to the left of the verb. Now, in this case, the verb is going to be an underline. So I'm going to look right to the left of my blank. And this is going to be very common on worksheets. Usually where the blank is, you're going to look right to the left of it, and the pronoun will always be there. So I'm going to look for J apostrophe. So, oh, look at that. My first one, J apostrophe, which was the pronoun I. So I'm going to put AI, A, over here, because that is the conjugated form of avoir for je, for I. Okay, the next one, same thing. We're going to look to the left, and we see the word il, the pronoun. So let's look for il. And there we go. We found il. And the conjugated form of avoir for il is a. So we're just going to put a in there. Next, we have Sam, A, Jonathan. Well, this is where I run into a little bit of a problem because Sam and Jonathan aren't any of our pronouns. But what we do know is that we can replace Sam and Jonathan with a pronoun, the same way you would do in English. Now, let me flip back to my pronouns chart. So, Sam and Jonathan, what would be the most appropriate pronoun to use in English? Well, I know that Sam is probably a boy and Jonathan is probably a boy, so I'm going to use this one over here, ils, which is they, and it's males. So it's a group of males. And once again, I'm going to assume that Sam and Jonathan are both boys, which is why I'm going to use ils. So I'm going to use ils, ont, because ont is the conjugated form of the verb avoir. Next, I'm going to look to my blank, look right to the left, and an apostrophe. Do I have an apostrophe here? Nope. So I'm going to look to the left again. And the next word is nous. And I'm going to go down. And look at there. I have nous, and the conjugated form is avant. A-V-O-N-S. The next one I'm going to look down. There's my blank. To the left, I have vous. And let's look down for the pronoun vous. And I have vous avez right over here. So A-V-E-Z, A-V-E-Z. And the last one, I have tu blank une pomme. I'm going to look for my pronoun tu. There we go, tu as. Tu as une pomme. I do plan on making a follow-up video for the verb être, which means to be, which is the second most common and important verb in French. And I'll also make a series of videos for the ER verbs, the IR verbs, and the RE verbs, which are the three group verbs that I mentioned earlier on in the video. So until next time, au revoir and